This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Boy, am I tired right now. Could have been the energy that was drained from me after watching AEW this past week, but nah. I think a lot of it is just trying to get my body to adjust to harder work schedules. Staying busy, doing my own thing, trying to make ends meet where they may. And we're still having fun talking about pro wrestling, regardless of how bleak the future looks, especially for all elite wrestling. WWE, the jury is still out on their future. I'm more cautiously optimistic with their direction headed into 2023 than I am AEW. And you will see why after we talk about this week's Dynamite. Before we do, though, all the usual jazz. YouTube and Rumble every week, Monday and Friday. Subscribe, like, comment, all that good stuff. Today's show, it's going to be the usual Friday podcast where we try and sample whatever good we can take away from AEW. Spoiler alert, there's not a whole lot. And then we'll turn things over to the retro portion of the podcast for today, where we talk about when the wrestling product was actually good. And we remember a time when things actually made sense and when stars were actual stars. And they were actually drawing money on a mainstream scale. Anyway, all on the docket for today's program. And we actually have both NWA and World Class TV to get into this week. But we'll go ahead and get Dynamite out of the way first because there's really no sense in dwelling on that show right now, especially with where things are headed right now after the whole media scrum investigation closure. By the way, if you did not see my analysis of that, make sure you check out the beginning of last week's podcast. I throw my 2 cents into the whole investigation fallout. And trust me, I have as many unanswered questions as the rest of you rational thinking people do as well. None of whom are apparently in the media outlets reporting on any of it, because they're all in the tank for the elite anyway. I mean, why would anybody be siding with Punk right now? Now, when you're getting paid to keep AEW under good wraps and not rock the boat in any way. As long as we pretend things are fine and we ignore the giant cloud of smoke in the background, I'll be good. Pay no attention to all the glaring problems and pretend everything's perfectly fine. And eventually we'll all forget about it in due time. At least that's what they want you to think. God, this show kills me. Metaphorically speaking, but I mean, who knows? After the way this show's been going for weeks now, that may turn out to be a physical problem down the road. Pretty soon, AEW will have to display a warning message before all their TV shows. AEW Dynamite, hazardous to your health. Consult your doctor before viewing. I don't know. Was the show as bad as last week? Probably not. I mean, last week's show was just the drizzling shites from pretty much start to finish. This week at least had a good couple things of note. It still wasn't a good show, but I mean, since AEW decided to adopt the TNA model when it comes to booking and logic gaffes, guess we'll start having to grade these shows on the TNA curve. A bad show was a bad show, and the good shows were moderately bad, and the really good shows were better than average. Much like last week, though, I really didn't write a whole lot down about the actual segments because I mean, honestly, why would I at this point? Everything I said last week can basically be attributed here. Random, sporadic shit happening for no reason, booking problems up and down the card, absolutely no vision or straightforward thinking of any of the key storylines right now. It's all a jumbled mess, and with Punk out of the picture now, we're basically left with the EVPs and Chris Jericho whispering in Tony's ear, trying to call the shots and weigh down as much as the show as possible with all their ineptitude. Show didn't start off too bad with this 8-man tag featuring the Guns, Swerve in Our Glory, the Acclaimed, and FTR. I don't really have an issue with any of the teams here, personally. FTR is obviously the best of the bunch, no question. Austin and Colton have been a relatively solid underneath team. Keith and Swerve have had some heavy criticisms of their matches before, and while I'm still over them holding off the inevitable split that everybody sees coming a mile away whenever that happens, their matches aren't bad necessarily. And then, of course, you got the Acclaimed, who are kind of doing their own thing right now with Billy Gunn. It's working for the audience. Like I noted last week, they're the only team that's charismatic enough to make all that goofy comedy shit work. So hats off to them for going through with it, regardless of how juvenile it all comes across. I think my only real issue here is the fact that it is once again Tony Khan burying FTR in the middle of the cesspool that's AEW's tag division right now. I mean, Cash and Dax are obviously the best team in the company. I mean, that's a fact just based on the way the crowd reacts to them when they come out for their segments. But not only are the AEW belts not on FTR, but they aren't even being factored into the title picture at the pay-per-view. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't Swerve and Keith getting the title shot again? So your best tag team on the roster, and they're not even factored into the Full Gear pay-per-view in 2 weeks. Unless they're wrestling Austin and Colton, which, I mean, no offense to the Ass Boys, but really? You're going to have your top babyface tag team wrestling two underneath heels that barely win matches and are nothing more than comedy acts most of the time? And that'd be like taking the Midnight Express and pairing them in a feud with, I don't know, the fucking Bushwhackers. Just a total waste. The match here had its moments, but I've also kind of been over the whole multi-man clusterfuck tag matches for a long time. You know, especially in modern wrestling where it just ends up turning into guys doing a bunch of spots and there's no coherency to any of it. I felt bad for Cash. They tried to do a spot toward the beginning where all of the baby faces were in the four corners of the ring giving the heels a series of punches, and it was all so poorly mistimed from everybody. By the time Cash looked over his shoulder and tried to line up his shots with everyone else, everyone was already pounding away, so Cash had to turn around and go, shit. Of course, they come back from break and show us a split-screen replay where Big Cass took out one of the baby faces on the floor with a big boot. At which point I realized, when the hell did Cass come out for this match? Did I just completely miss him walking down the aisleway with Austin and Colton, or did he sneak in the back door when I wasn't paying attention? Either way, he proved to be completely futile during this whole thing. Just another waste of a signing from Cocaine Khan, signing up dudes and having no clue what to do with them. No wonder Cass looked pissed off in that segment weeks back where all the firm guys are just standing in the ring with dicks in hand. Eventually, it breaks down into the usual schmoz. Everyone's doing dives. Referee doesn't even try to enforce any kind of rules. And then somehow Cash and Dax hit the big rig on one of the Ass Boys for the 3. So at least the right guys went over. I don't know what good that does to build excitement for the Acclaimed Swerve and Keith title match. But that would also imply that Tony is a good booker and knows how to properly effectuate pay-per-view hype, which he clearly does not. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. As long as the Beta Bucks are in Tony's ear, you can pretty much bank on the idea that FTR are never going to be in that top spot in the division. Now, the people will still cheer him like God. They'll still be over, but it's not going to matter at the end of the day when the pussies in charge can't see past their own wave of bullshit. So unless Tony puts his foot down, you can pretty much expect this booking of FTR to continue being wasted away. So they followed that with this MJF pre-tape, an interview that he apparently did with some sports podcaster. No idea who it was. I mean, everyone's got a podcast in 2022. Big whoop. Now, the actual promo itself was fantastic. MJF doing the only bit of solid pay-per-view hype on this entire show by explaining why he's going to be the world champion and why we should all tune in to see him beat the Valvoline attendant. My issue more so comes from the way they all set this up. And AEW's done this BS before where they'll throw a graphic up on the screen at the very beginning of the program saying, "Tonight, MJF speaks," or "Tonight, MJF live to address the fans." And it's supposed to give you the impression that he's going to maybe be out in the ring. They're going to devote like 5 to 10 minutes to give MJF his chance to let him do his thing. And then it turns out to be a false advertisement where you get MJF on screen, but it's for like 1 minute, and he's never seen or spoken of for the remainder of the night. And, you know, this isn't just exclusive to MJF because they do this with other people too, whether it's teasing promo segments or face-offs between individuals, and then it ends up being some short backstage segment where it's just a bunch of people screaming at each other. No one actually ever says anything or does anything of note. You know, they said at the beginning of the show, MJF will address his upcoming program with Jon Moxley. And at the time, I'm like, oh, goody. Okay, we'll get to hear MJF come out to the ring, and maybe Mox will come down. They can do a face-to-face. It'll be a way to build excitement for their title match since they did a horrible job in the last 2 weeks of doing so. They laid both guys out on TV like geeks, and MJF wasn't even on the show last week. And like I said, it was good material from MJF, but motherfucker was on camera for like a minute and a half, and we never saw him actually appear on the show in person. The show's in 2 weeks, guys. What the hell's going on here? I mean, Mox was on the show later on. Why couldn't MJF be there? I mean, he's going to win the world title in 2 weeks. Figured you maybe want to have him there to actually engage with Moxley so we can hear Mox get pooned on the stick. Or maybe that's what Tony was actively avoiding because he just can't get enough of the balding oil mechanic. So then Ethan Page wrestled Eddie Kingston in a tournament eliminator match. Okay, serious question here. What the fuck is an AEW tournament eliminator match? And why do these idiot commentators always assume that everybody watching knows what it is? Seriously, I have been asking this question since the first time I ever heard the name Tournament Eliminator being thrown out, and I am yet to get an answer from anybody. Is it an actual tournament? Is it a qualifying match? Is it a number one contenders match? No fucking clue, but in the land of AEW, where it's always expected that everybody knows what's going on 100% of the time, of course they don't bother to actually explain the rules of anything. No graphics, no mention from anybody at the booth, despite the fact that they got 3 of these morons just sitting there and beating their dicks off through most of the matches anyway. Nope, they're just playing along like everybody else knows what's going on. And speaking of these people presuming everybody watching already knows what's going on, apparently this is a match that is also an extension from a previous Ethan Page-Eddie Kingston rivalry. A rivalry that took place where, you ask? You guessed it. The indie circuit. Probably in a bunch of outlaw promotions in the middle of fucking field in Dickoff, Arkansas, in front of 30 people and some cows. So, of course, they just say these two have had a bunch of matches in the past, not bothering to actually show us some footage of anything prior, or just have the two do a pre-match promo, or something to explain why they hate each other and why their feud stems back from wherever they wrestled. No, they just throw them out here cold and expect any of the people watching to give 2 shits. Newsflash, I don't. And I probably wouldn't be in the minority. The match was a match. I've seen Ethan Page wrestle a sum total of twice in the last year. He's been wasted potential since the day he showed up. I mean, he came in during the pandemic era. They dicked around with him forever. I remember he had that shitty coffin match with Darby on television. Eventually, they stuck him with Dan Lambert and Scorpio Sky, where he pretty much stood in the background for a lot of it. And now he's in another meaningless faction with a bunch of other bodies. It's like, who cares? I had no idea why Ortiz was out there during this. Guess him and Kingston are still appearing. I have no idea what happened to Santana. I mean, he's completely vanished from the show. And Ortiz, last time we saw him on TV wrestling, wasn't he getting his head shaved by Jericho after like 1 week's build? Again, this is all the same shit I talk about every week on this show. And you can run me up the flagpole for always bringing it up, but I'm going to keep on harping on it because it needs to be said. Nothing makes sense on the show. Nothing is ever followed up on. Nothing ever bleeds over from one program to the next. The announcer just assumed that everybody's in on the gag and we all know what's going on. It's a total clusterfuck every week on this show. There are no replays. There are rarely any promo packages. Just a complete disaster. Speaking of Jericho, speaking of not following up on things, remember last week in that Colt Cabana match how I was talking about how Cabana was brought back just so they could flip Punk the Bird and how he probably would not be on the show this week because people just randomly show up and disappear for no reason? Well, guess who wasn't on the show this week? It's unbelievable. Getting back to this, though, they did some stuff. Crowd didn't really care all that much about it. Kingston's lost a ton of momentum in the last year alone. The finish to this was outstanding for a whole variety of reasons, and I mean that ironically. If you do not watch this match, you have to go out of your way to check this out just to see the 30 seconds between Stokely Hathaway and Paul Turner. I am not kidding you when I say that Paul Turner's arguing with Stokely may have been the greatest bit of dramatic overselling of gestures I have seen in wrestling in a long time. He looked hokier than Kenny Omega's goofy aneurysms during his segments. I mean, the fact that Ethan Page went over gives me indication that Eddie's still in the doghouse for whatever reason. I mean, not that I'm complaining. I've sort of bailed from the Eddie Kingston bandwagon a long time ago. They had something with him a year ago when he was feuding with Punk, and they were trying to capitalize on the momentum after that Players Tribune article. Had all that buzz behind him, and that's kind of the story of Tony Khan's booking. He just has no concept of how to execute on something hot that's handed right in front of him. Every time, he drops the ball. And Eddie Kingston's no different. Look at where he is 12 months after the fact. Doing a job to the same fucking clown that last time I remember him wrestling on TV. Wasn't he doing a job to Orange fucking Cassidy of all people? So yeah, Booking Logic 101 from the greatest booker of our generation, ladies and gents. Give me a break. Wardlow had a quick squash with that Arya Daivari dude. Beat him with a bunch of power bombs. Same story there as normal. People aren't really responding to the powerbomb symphony like they did a few months ago. Again, Tony Khan's shitty booking rendering its ugly head. I'm more so hung up on the other shitty booking part of this segment. The completely random, out of the blue, that everybody saw coming a mile away heel turn from Samoa Joe, where he laid out Wardlow afterwards when, of all people, Powerhouse Hobbs was making his way down to the ring. So, of course, the camera fucking misses the actual shot of Joe clocking Wardlow with his Ring of Honor TV title, because his company is a low-rent knockoff of WCW. And of course, Excalibur has to throw in his outlaw statement of the show when he said, "We've been seeing the tensions boiling over between Samoa Joe and Wardlow for weeks now." To which I said, "No, we haven't, you lying sack of snake feces. Fuck you and your geeky-looking turtle mask." And to make things even more Bush League in presentation, what is this all setting up for the Full Gear pay-per-view, you might ask? No fucking idea. At first, I thought it was Hobbs and Wardlow, since it appeared that's what they were building to here. But because Tony Khan has the worst case of ADHD since Vince Russo took the book in the late 90s, he couldn't even wait 2 more weeks to blow off the Samoa Joe heel turn. Make people actually pay to see it. You know, like a smart promoter would do. So now I have no idea what this is all setting up. Presumably a 3-way, because you just can't get enough of those garbage-ass multi-person matches in wrestling. But yeah, leave it to Tony Khan to book a segment where Powerhouse Hobbs is completely overshadowed like a dork, all because Samoa Joe had to randomly turn heel on Wardlow in the middle of this god-awful TV program when absolutely nobody could have cared. And of course, the entire focus is on Joe and Wardlow, while Hobbs is a total afterthought by the end. Way to go, Tony. Stellar job right there. Now, on the topic of garbage booking performances, boy, these AEW segments really do bleed over well together, don't they? Jade Cargill and Nyla Rose are apparently going to have a title match at the pay-per-view. This is where we've come with the women's division after 3 years. They are still trying to make Nyla Rose a thing. Boy, howdy. At least I can say there was one bright spot on the program this week when it came to actually effectuating pay-per-view interest. Oddly enough, it was the girls that saved it too. Go figure. This Britt Baker-Saraya promo face-off. It was... I'm not going to say it was outstanding because I think that was pushing it a little. But this was pretty good from both parties. For the first time since she showed up, Saraya actually sounded comfortable on the microphone. She had fire. She didn't seem nervous. She went in there, went toe-to-toe with Britt on the mic. And Britt's probably the best female promo in the entire company. But this is really good. Again, going back to the MJF thing from earlier, they did everything in their power to draw intrigue to seeing that fight happen. As poorly as they've been building to it on TV, and as much as it gets lost in the shuffle when they're trying to spotlight like 40 other girls at once, here they didn't do any of that. It was all about Britt. It was all about Saraya. Tony Schiavone, well, he just stood there like a dork like he always does. But Saraya immediately dives in and breaks the news that the doctors cleared her to compete. Of course, she has to cry about it, but I mean, for her, it was genuinely an emotional moment. I mean, she's basically been retired for the better part of 6 years, so I get how she get choked up about that. This is a big deal, so I'm not going to rake her over the coals for that. Meanwhile, Britt's talking about how Saraya claims that AEW is her house now, yet she's just like every other WWE reject that's shown up under the roof that Britt built from the beginning, and now she's trying to stake her claim that it's her property when she's just residing in it. And her little go-home line at the end here was great, where she goes, "Bitch, we don't take walk-ins, so make an appointment." Of course, everyone's applauding Britt for another stellar heel performance, because that's what you do in wrestling when a bad guy says something to demean the babyface. You cheer the villain for owning the protagonist. Luckily, Saraya had a good retort for everything. Talked about how Britt's an ungrateful prick that's only been around for a cup of coffee, while Saraya's had to grind for years just to break in and prove she belonged in the business. Said that Britt has no idea what it's like to be publicly humiliated on live broadcast television, no idea what it's like to battle a drug addiction and overcome it. She basically announces the match right then and there. Britt versus Saraya for Full Gear. Like I said, the promo face-off between these two is really damn good. The stuff afterwards where Saraya kind of awkwardly paused and didn't know whether or not to leave the ring while she was trying to hold back from smiling. Yeah, that part was a little shaky. I think she should have just left the ring after the mic drop and left Britt to piss in the wind like a heel should be after being outclassed. Problem was they wanted to try and sprinkle in a heat angle, and, well, it didn't come off well in execution, but Not a bad idea in theory, just not capitalized on well, but I'm not going to take him to task too much for that. I'll say this. While I have my reservations about them actually going through with this after all of Soraya's neck complications and Britt's history of injuries, got to admit, I'm sure as hell more interested in this than I am most of the card right now. MJF and Moxley is the only other thing I'm remotely interested in, and that's mostly because I just want to see MJF win the title. The match I couldn't give a fuck less about. But Saraya and Britt, that has some potential. It's Soraya's first match in well over 6 years, her debut in AEW, or her debut match in AEW, and it's against arguably their top female star right now. I don't know. It's hard to judge whether or not it'll pop any last-minute pay-per-view buys, but if there's some WWE leftover fans that kind of caught wind that Saraya is jumping ship to AEW and there is interest from those old fans that want to see her wrestle again, they might get some numbers out of it. It's entirely possible. It is ironic how they're going to end up feeding their top female star in the division to put over another former WWE reject, but hey, TNA syndrome. What can you do? Unfortunately, from there, we have to go from the penthouse to the outhouse, because AEW never knows how to follow up on something good whenever they rarely do something good to begin with. They booked a Trent Beretta Jay Lethal match. And I'm sorry, love Jay Lethal, been a big fan of his for a long time, but I have taken a vow to actively boycott anything on this show involving the best friends, namely Orange Cassidy. The gimmick is a fucking joke. It's been a joke since day one. And the fact that they are still prostrating this thing on television after like 3 years, it's absolutely absurd. Chucky Finster, nothing else needs to be said about that bucktooth idiot. Danhausen, and that one about writes itself. Obvious joke, clearly a geek we were never intended to take seriously. I have no idea why he's there. Then you got the rest of the peanut gallery in Lethal's group. And sorry to say, that includes Jeff Jarrett. Look, I appreciate he actually took a minute to establish his connections with Lethal and Dutt. You know, that's at least going out of your way to give people continuity and explain why they're all friends. The Satnam Singh thing doesn't make a lick of sense, but no one cares about the Giant Gonzalez bootleg in 2022. I'm more so just focused on the fact that Double J is one of those guys that's been overexposed for decades now. And even if I don't have anything against him personally, he's just one of those dudes that when he shows up on TV, I immediately start groaning. I don't want to see him anymore. I don't want to hear him talk anymore. I especially don't need to see him in an on-screen role getting a fucking push in 2022. Good God almighty. Again, I don't know what his involvement is going to be on-screen versus what he'll be doing off-camera. Apparently, he's been signed to help kind of oversee some of the business roles alongside Tony Khan. Okay, great. Does that role necessitate Jeff Jarrett being on the show every week to do promos and eat up screen time? No, not at all. I didn't want to see it in WCW. I didn't want to see it in TNA. And I damn sure do not need to see it in 2022 in AEW. So, whatever his character role is on camera, I can only hope and pray that it doesn't last long. You know, they use him for a pay-per-view appearance, and then afterwards he's gone. Fine. But if he sticks around long-term and starts taking up like 5 minutes of camera time every week, we might need to have a different conversation about that. And you know, on the other hand, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe a Jeff Jarrett promo ain't as bad as it seems if it means substituting for Jungle Boy ever having to speak again. Just saying. After that, we had this Moxley promo with Sir William Regal. And whereas with MJF, his segment was about a minute-long clip of a podcast interview he did, not actually making a single appearance on the show, here they gave Moxley about 6 minutes to just do his thing, I guess. He talked about his history with Regal and how they first met. said that Moxley was in way over his head the first time he ever tried to pick a fight with Regal, and he got stretched for it. Then years later, Moxley got his second chance at redemption to earn Regal's approval. But with MJF, he's been handed everything for his entire career, and at Full Gear, for the first time in his life, MJF is going to have to earn it if he wants to be the champion. He made some obscure reference about the devil and said that Moxley has seen the devil and MJF ain't that guy. And that's pretty much all there was to the segment. It was a Moxley promo. Everything he's involved with, it's always going to fall under that category of, for the kind of people that like that kind of thing, that's the kind of thing those people like. And I know it's an overused, corny quote, but it's true when it comes to Jon Moxley, man. I don't like his ring work. I never have. I don't particularly find his promos engaging anymore. At one point, I made the argument that they sounded very authentic, and I don't know. Then he just started babbling incoherent dialects about eating people's guts and drinking their blood for dinner, and yeah, I about checked out after hearing that multiple times. So I don't really even get much out of Moxley's promos at this stage. I'll talk more about where I stand with the whole dynamic of him and MJF when I kind of run down the Full Gear card next week, but for what this was, it was all right. I still think Regal's turning heel, but I'll talk about that a little more next time. Then there was a girls' match. I think enough's been said about that. The main event, however, well, there are certainly things to be said about that, I think. It's Bryan Danielson versus Sammy Guevara in a 2 out of 3 falls match. Again, why? I don't know. Apparently because Danielson had a 2 out of 3 falls match with Daniel Garcia about a month ago, so guess we have to do another one, this time with him and Guevara. It's about where the logic stops with me. And I can once again sit here and go into my little tirade about how meaningless Danielson has been on this program for almost the entire year, but honestly, I don't even really know if I have the energy to vent about that again. He's obviously not going to have a bad match. He's going to work his ass off. He's going to try and piece something together that makes somewhat of coherent sense. And while I don't really find Sammy Guevara all that compelling at this point, at least him and Ty Conti are over his heels to where it gets the people to rally behind Danielson. So in a rare instance for AEW, we actually have face and heel dynamics that made sense. They basically got about 2 minutes in before Guevara heaved a chair at Danielson's head for the DQ on the first fall. And the actual chair throw looked pretty good. I don't really think I need to see Danielson having foreign objects thrown at his head after all the concussion issues in his career, but there you go. And of course, that was a chance for Guevara to work over Danielson and get the heat on him. Ended up beating him in the second fall with the GTH. Keep in mind, all of that happened within about 8 minutes. So you could tell they were really trying to rush to get all this stuff in. And in about the last 5 or so minutes, that's when they started breaking out a bunch of high spot stuff. Crowd got a little more invested in it. I have no idea why Danielson is doing that stupid Poison Rana spot, other than the fact that he's just given up and he's just rolling with the punches. Hey, if everyone's doing it, regardless how stupid it looks, why not? But, well, the usual. Ty Conti got ejected from ringside. Why that didn't happen the moment she came out at the beginning of the match, I have no earthly clue, but whatever. Then Danielson and Guevara traded some holds. They do a spot where Guevara tries to hit Danielson with the senton, but Danielson got the knees up, put Guevara in the label lock, and ended up forcing a ref stoppage. It's like I said before, Danielson's obviously there at this point to just wrestle and collect a paycheck. I wish he weren't so complacent in that role, because at one point, he was one of my favorite guys to watch on this show. Could have actually been their top heel champion when Adam Page was the most boring mid-card babyface world champion in the history of modern wrestling. Instead, they had to keep the belt on him, and Danielson pretty much ceased to matter after the fact. Now he's still there, but he's just a cog in the wheel at this stage. Let's just call it as it is, man. He doesn't add or detract from the show in any way. He just kind of pops in occasionally, and now he's just another one of the boys. At least with the way he's presented on television. Definitely not the same top guy he was 12 months ago. And I really don't think that can be argued. You know, I've already said my piece on Sammy Guevara. The way that guy works, he'll be lucky if he's wrestling in the next 5 years, much less being taken seriously as a guy you'd want to push as a top heel. I don't really have much input beyond that. It was a match. Wasn't offensive. I wasn't particularly engaged. And a lot of that's just a reflection on the poor mismanagement of Bryan Danielson in the last year. He should have been a bigger deal than he ended up becoming, and it's a real shame how badly they missed the boat on him. And I think that's partial to blame on Tony Khan, partial to blame on Bryan Danielson. You know, Danielson is at that stage in his career where he should be able to have some input of his booking. And if he feels that he's not being treated right or that he should be treated better, he should step up and say something. Even if he doesn't want to be the world champion. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand why Danielson is there if he's just kind of complacent being a guy. Like, why? Like, you're clearly a step above a lot of the guys on that roster anyway. Why would you settle for less? Unless you know for a fact that you're not going to be sticking around in the business much longer, which, I mean, I understand in that case if you're kind of treating this like a retirement tour, but you could still get so much more mileage out of it by just demanding more. But apparently Danielson doesn't want that. I don't know. I mean, he's been hurt a couple times, so maybe it's just him trying to ease back a little bit, but whatever the case is, he's just not coming across the same he did about a year ago. So here we sit, a couple weeks out from the Full Gear show, and aside from, I think, 3 matches, I have no idea what is on that card right now. I know it's MJF and Moxley for the world title, Saraya versus Britt Baker for no titles. I can't even remember who the actual champion is in that division right now, but I know it's not Britt. We also have the Acclaimed Swerve in Our Glory tag title match, which should be good, but it won't come anywhere close to the level of the match they had at the last AEW pay-per-view, when the Acclaimed should have won the belts, but they didn't because Tony doesn't know how to think on his feet. But there you have it. Another completely forgettable, mostly nonsensical television program that probably ran off a whole lot of viewers like they've effectively been doing for weeks now. Y'all think Punk being blacklisted was a good call? Because we're seeing what happens when the EVPs are overseeing things again. You're telling me that it's going to be better off with Punk out of the equation? All right, dude. Feel free to believe that if you want, but the dip in quality of these shows in a post-Punk AEW, they are not showing signs of hope. And it's only going to worsen when Omega and the Bucks are actually back on the show again. That's all I'm saying. So I think we're good to move on here. So we'll go to the retro portion of the podcast for today. NWA World Championship Wrestling, November 8th, 1986. And our cold open for the week was the replay of Hawk and Animal on top of the scaffolding, demonstrating what Beautiful Bobby and Loverboy Dennis's skulls were going to look like after they got tossed off the platform. And they demonstrated this by throwing pumpkins off of the riser. And, well, I wouldn't consider myself an anatomist by any stretch. I have not studied the human body very extensively, but I find it highly unlikely that if Bobby and Dennis were to fall from a 30-foot platform, that their skulls would spontaneously combust. They'd probably just, smash the ground really hard and be carted off to the morgue shortly thereafter. Evidently, that's what ended up happening after the match was over, but we'll talk about that in due time. Now, of course, the genius behind Hawk and Animal using pumpkins in that skit was that it was going to get the fans in the studio to start calling the Midnight Express Pumpkinheads. And I never really thought about this very extensively, but Corny's head did sort of resemble a pumpkin back in 1986. Think about it. Maybe it was just the haircut. And only someone like Jim Cornette could pull off a promo segment where at the same time he's ranting and raving about the barbaric nature of the scaffold environment and how dangerous it is, he's also meticulously running down the rules of the match, saying it's anything goes, no DQ, and the only way to win is by throwing your opponent off of the platform to send them crashing down to the ring mat. Shameless plug. I love it. He also informed us here that in addition to Bobby and Dennis preparing for the match, Big Bubba was also preparing by scaling up some poles. And I think you can already tell where my juvenile brain was headed. For the record, no, I do not believe Bubba Rogers ever engaged in pole dancing. Aside from that, though, he did a hell of a plug for the match. And then we went to a Midnight Express Big Bubba versus Tony Zane, Vernon Deaton, and Brody Chase six-man. And I've got to say this right out of the gate. The visual of Big Bubba jump-starting a match while wearing his top hat, classic. Typical Midnight Beatdown that we've all come to expect by now. Bobby Eaton trying to do waist locks and chain holds with Brody Chase looked like a monkey fucking a football. And none of the blame to be put on Bobby for that. That was all on Brody for just being a horrible pro wrestler. Corny also teasing the inevitable at the desk, saying there's no way on God's green earth that he was going to scale the scaffold and get involved in any way, shape, or form during that match. A likely story. So, of course, the heels won. Bubba hit a top rope assisted splash on one of the guys. I think it was Deaton. Who cares? Then they brought out Slick Rick for a promo ahead of his World Heavyweight title defense against Nikita Koloff at Starrcade, telling Nikita he's got 2.5 weeks until he has to walk the aisle and prove something to the champ. And for Flair, he needs the big money payout at Starrcade because, well, I'm not sure if any of you picked up on this or not. Maybe you didn't. But Ric Flair was kind of into the luxury lifestyle. He likes the private jets, the custom suits, private hotel rooms for leisure activities. And in order to guarantee the big payout, he needs to be the world's heavyweight champion. Pretty much all there was to say about that. And then coming back from break, we went to the Starrcade Control Center for a card update. Hilariously in the background, while Tony Schiavone is welcoming everybody to the studio, they've also got Abdullah the Butcher in the background bleeding and mashing his teeth into somebody. I think it was Manny Fernandez. I don't know why, but the combination of Abdullah biting dudes while Tony's sitting there calmly running down the Starrcade show, I had a good laugh at that. So this little segment was all dedicated to the Four Horsemen Rock and Roll Express story, dating all the way back to the Greensboro show, where the Horsemen attacked Ricky and Robert in the locker room and rubbed poor Ricky Morton's face into the concrete. And then following that was the angle where they had broken poor Ricky's nose, causing him to wear a face mask for the better part of the entire summer. But all that bad blood, all those heat angles between the two teams, they're now going to come full circle at Starrcade, as they'll be going at it for the World Tag Team titles inside a cage. And in addition, we will also be getting Ravishing Rick Rude versus Wahoo McDaniel in an Indian strap match. Well, that came right the hell out of nowhere, didn't it? Actually, now that I'm thinking of it, why do I have no recollection of that match ever happening? I remember Starrcade 86 pretty vividly. I had no memory there was ever a strap match with Rick Rude and Wahoo McDaniel on that card. Interesting. In any case, they plugged that program by showing us Wahoo getting hung over the top rope with a rope by his neck, courtesy of the Paul Jones Army. And he's basically selling this match to the folks at home by talking about how the strap match is his kind of gimmick match. He's never lost one. And Rick Rude is probably one of his toughest opponents yet. So if he winds up losing that match, he has no one to blame but himself. A very humbling man that Wahoo McDaniel was. And I know what you're probably thinking right about now. Scaffold matches, first blood matches, strap matches, cage matches. Yeah, that's a lot of gimmicks. When you take into account that you only really saw these kinds of gimmick matches on the big stages, well, turns out it actually gave them sort of an appeal. Instead of mindlessly doing them on every television show for free, they actually used to save these for the big blow-offs when they would actually mean something. It's kind of the same story with Starrcade 85 that we reviewed last year. Lots of gimmicks, lots of blood, but every match had a story and a purpose. All the gimmick matches fit the story. So, even if you kind of got overexposed and beat to death with the gimmick matches throughout the show, it worked. Nowadays, you see gimmick matches every week on TV, and none of them mean a damn thing anymore. It's what happens when you overdo something to the point where you get no return on the investment. Boy, is AEW learning the hard way on that one now. Then we had a quick squash with Ivan and Crusher going up against Mike Samani and Johnny Savage. And it was at this point where they finally informed us that the official for the program this week was Scrappy McGowan, who very closely resembled Hulk Hogan if Hogan didn't have any kind of body definition or muscle tone. Same haircut and beard and everything. Kind of the only interesting thing to note about the match, Ivan and Crusher went over after Ivan gave Samani a leg drop. I think Tony mentioned this in the Starrcade report too. Ivan and Crusher end up facing the Kansas Jayhawks for the United States tag titles on the card. Belts that I had almost completely forgotten about, even though they spent like 5 or 6 consecutive shows bringing in all this influx of tag teams to build up to the tournament. I think I talked about it before. When they kind of reintroduced the United States tag titles, I basically remember the Midnight Express Fantastics matches from like 87 and 88. Pretty much anything that happened before they put the straps on Bobby and Stan, I have no memory of. It has completely escaped my memory. So after that, we cut to the Superpowers for a promo segment. Dusty and Nikita sporting their 2 singles belts in the lead up to their Starrcade matches. Of course, we already covered the Flair-Nikita title match. But we also have Tully and Dusty in the first blood match for the World's Television title. The apparent second prestigious title in the NWA at the time. And when Dusty's the champ, he's going to try to run that down your throat. But you got Dusty passionately saying that if there was ever any doubt that Nikita could join forces with Dusty over a common bond, that can all now be erased. The Superpowers have united, and together they stand. And Nikita actually cut a hell of a promo on Ric Flair, talking about how Rick has been saying a lot of good things about Nikita over the year, but Nikita knows Flair's game plan. "I too smart," was an exact quote, actually. Says that he should hold on to his world title real tight, because after Starrcade, there's a good chance he may never hold it again. And, this is all very basic build, but what we forgot to mention here was that Nikita was out at the commentary desk strategically right after the Russians just got done with their squash. So Ivan and Crusher are still in the ring while this is all going down. And Ivan ends up cutting off Nikita mid-sentence, telling him to get in the ring and stop engaging with this filthy American. So Ivan's cutting the promo on Nikita. Dusty tries to confront him in the ring and tell him to go pound sand, basically. And, of course, Crusher ends up jumping Dusty. And while they're putting the boots to him 2-on-1, here comes Nikita. And now he's got a real decision to make. Who does he stand for? His fellow Russian brethren or the superpowers? And Nikita gets in the ring. He thinks about it momentarily. And when Crusher turns around, boom! Nikita decks him with a sickle. And Dusty's able to fend off Ivan so that Nikita and Dusty can leave together. And poor old Uncle Ivan and Crusher are left to piss in the wind. Now, of course, this got over tremendously with the studio crowd. I talk about this every time, but it is amazing to me to think how quickly all of this came together and how Nikita basically went from top heel to top babyface almost with a snap of a finger. And it made total storyline sense, too. It's the genius of Dusty Rhodes. What more can you say about it? So coming back from break, we had the Rock and Roll Express out to cut a promo. And actually, this is another case where Ricky was able to cut the promo straight to the man he and Robert were going to be wrestling at Starrcade, because Arn Anderson was already in the ring prepping to get set for his match. So Ricky basically ran him down and said that the cage match was their pick and their environment to settle the score with the Horsemen once and for all. Very simple little promo. And they strategically just had Robert stand there and not say anything. Probably a wise move. And then we went to the ring. Arn Anderson killed Eddie Roberts in about 30 seconds with a gourd buster, while simultaneously cutting a heel promo on the Rock and Roll Express, saying, "I don't need to be putting up with this shit. Ricky and Robert call me out on television like that." It's a good heel stuff right there. That was followed with Wahoo McDaniel doing another promo to promote his strap match with Rick Rude. He literally just regurgitated what he said in the studio earlier on. Although we did get the infamous touching all four corners of the ring to win bit, which I just kind of shook my head at. Not my favorite match stipulation in the world. We'll just leave it at that. And then back from commercial, we had JJ and Tully out to do a promo, hyping up the first blood match with Tully and Dusty. A pretty underhanded slimeball JJ promo here, where he's talking about how Starrcade has always prided itself on being the big event where the people get to decide the match stipulations and blow-offs. And it just so happens that the people want to see Tully go into Starrcade 86 and bloody up Dusty for the whole world to see. And of course, as we all know, you got to give the people what they want, right? And then Tully cut probably the greatest fiery promo of his entire career, screaming at Dusty and slapping the podium, calling him out for making a career out of getting what he wants and calling the shots from day one. But not this time, because this is Tully's match. And after Starrcade is all said and done, Tully has taken back his world's television title. And by the time this promo started to the time it ended, I believe Tully's skin pigment went from relatively tan to whatever a step beyond crimson is. He was starting to reach sangria wine levels of red. I legitimately thought he was going to start spewing blood from his eyes. That is how enraged this man was. What a fucking promo Tully was. I say it every week virtually, but seriously, you want to talk about truly underappreciated promos in the peak years of wrestling? Tully Blanchard is high up on that list, especially when it came to heel promos. God, that guy was damn good. As was gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, but I mean, that kind of goes without saying. Different kind of heel, though. He wrestled Pablo Crenshaw here. And I guess because this was, we got to cram in as many bodies as we possibly can into about 30 minutes this week, we also had Bill Dundee out to provide commentary. Why, I have no idea. seeing as how Buddy was apparently wrestling Sam Houston at the Starrcade event, and, well, Bill Dundee was not. I think he was legitimately just there to put over all the heels and predict that all the bad guys were going to win their matches at Starrcade, including Jimmy Garvin going over Brad Armstrong, which apparently was another match they passingly mentioned at some point. Another match that I have no recollection ever happening. So yeah, that was a strange segment. And then those guys completely vanished, so we could cut to the booth for a Paul Jones Army promo. And whatever in the hell that outfit that Paul Jones had on was, it was making me long for the days when he just had the general outfit on. Anyhow, well, they were pretty much there to explain that they signed the contract for the Wahoo McDaniel match. However, they did not agree to the terms of a strap match. But apparently Rick Rude was okay doing the match because he is that confident that he can beat Wahoo in his own backyard. And for every lash that Wahoo gives Rude, Rude will give him 10. And right before they cut away, Tony goes to slowly feed the mic over to Manny Fernandez for input. And they're standing there. There's a pause. Bull just kind of snorts into the microphone. And then they all just walk away. Apparently, Bull had nothing to say after all. Great. Then we came back to the booth for Precious, Garvin, and Bill Dundee. And this was peak Jimmy Garvin. He is over the moon at the thought of being able to pound away on Brad Armstrong. He is so confident that he has that match in the bag, he's not even ashamed to boast about it. And of course, Precious is there next to him smiling and yucking it up for the camera. But here's the great part. The entire time this promo is going on, I am just watching the look on Bill Dundee's face, which pretty much read the expression of, why the fuck am I out here right now? And I have no idea what the answer to that was, because he was literally just there to stand around and not provide any thought. Again, I think they just decided before they taped this, hey, Bill, we're paying you. Why don't you go out there and just stand there on camera? It's not like we've completely wasted you on television since you showed up a couple months back. Just go out there and smile for the people. Cut a heel promo. Do something. I'm going to do some research on this because I'm starting to ask the question, why the fuck did they bring in Bill Dundee to the NWA in 1986 if he was literally going to do jack squat? Just a curious thought. So after that, we cut to an NWA Worldwide pre-tape with Bob Caudle and Handsome Jimmy, accompanied by Big Mama, who was quite the looker in this segment. First thing I directly wrote down was, good God, those eyebrows. That'd be enough to scare the neighbors away. Anyway, so Jimmy's plugging his match with Paul Jones, talking about how Willie is going to be hanging above the ring in a shark cage while Jimmy is having his way with Paul. And I had to note this too. Bob Caudle was not the only guy that was here while Jimmy was talking. I think this guy was actually at the Starrcade show last year doing the backstage interviews. I have no idea what his name was. It totally escaped me. But I remember he had a very goofy looking face. And I am laughing my ass off the entire time this thing is going down because whoever this guy was, he is standing in the background while Jimmy's cutting this promo, making all these awkward smiles and just standing there with his mouth gaped open. It was the most unintentionally hysterical thing on the entire program, and I had to go back and watch it several times over. I was dying. For the life of me, I cannot figure out who this fucking guy was, but if I ever find out, I will let you know, and I will put a screen cap of him up. Because him just hanging in the periphery, doing a goofy face while Handsome Jimmy's doing this off-the-wall promo. Sheer comedy. It's the only thing I can say about it. Anyway, Brad Armstrong wrestled the Grim Reaper, which was also sheer comedy. Guess this is their way of trying to see if Brad really had that personality on camera. Go out there and wrestle a guy named the Grim Reaper. And that he did. It didn't have a whole lot of comedic elements to it, but he won with the Russian leg sweep in about a minute. And speaking of the Russians, guess who was back for a show-closing promo? Good old Uncle Ivan and Crusher. And Ivan is here to read Nikita the Riot Act for that little stunt he pulled earlier on. Talking about how nephew Nikita should have come to Ivan and talked about wanting to team with Dusty instead of going behind their back. And now that Nikita has made his decision, he is ousted from the Russian family. He is no longer Ivan's nephew. He now has no family and no country, and he will never be forgiven for his actions. And he will be punished. Oh, the family feuds. How often will we see them? Poor Ivan, man. You know, you really feel bad for him, too. He's heartbroken that his nephew chose the American way of life over the Russian morals. That good old Nikita Koloff. What a sellout. Guess we'll see how he fares after Starrcade, now that you got Ivan and Crusher out seeking revenge. But on the topic of that show, damn, we're already coming up on Starrcade, aren't we? 2 weeks out. And the excitement is ramping up. The card's starting to come together. Top programs are all being slated. You know, I'm really looking forward to talking about that show again. It's going to be a fun time reliving what I think a lot of people remember as being one of the more all-time classic Starrcade events, especially the scaffold match. You know, it really goes to show just how loaded and stacked the talent pool was around this point. All those names, all those stars, all those big money programs. It was an amazing time to be a wrestling fan around that point. And you still had about another year or so before things totally went off the rails. But yeah, I guess all good things come to a close eventually, but we really are living a peak period in wrestling right about now. Arguably one of the last real good periods in wrestling in general. Sorry for all you Attitude Era fans out there, but no. All right, so let's go back in the time machine a few years prior to World Class. So what do we have this week? Well, we had a cat fight. That's always a fun time if you're the average heterosexual male in modern America. Women pulling at each other's hair and scuffling on the ground. That's, can be pretty entertaining. Especially when the two girls fighting are Sunshine and Precious. Because you know what that's all tied to. And if you don't, stay tuned. First, let's talk about the Super Ds. More specifically, Super Destroyer number 2, accompanied by Super Destroyer number 1 and Skandar Ogbar, our first world-class showcase for the Super Ds. Mercer had been hyping them up on prior shows, but here we got our first look at them. And of course, they are wearing the exact same masks and ring gear, so you can't tell them apart anyway, unless you knew what the Irwin brothers looked like under hoods. And it's an interesting little tidbit here, but the Super Ds in World Class were not the same Super Destroyers that worked in Eastern Championship Wrestling in the early 90s. In World Class, it was Bill and Scott Irwin, and we had seen Bill Irwin during the earlier period in 83 when he was mostly just used as an enhancement talent. And while I'm not too familiar with what the reason was for pairing Scott and Bill together under the hoods, much less calling them the Super Ds, I can probably venture a guess that this was probably around the point in 83 where World Class really started to burn out the Freebirds Von Erich matches. Pretty much the entire tag division up to that point consisted of those teams, with Devastation Inc. kind of sprinkled in here and there. So my guess is that they wanted to try and introduce another underneath heel team to give the Von Erichs someone to eventually feud with down the road. There was also some turnover with some of the roster around this point. I think the Mongol ended up leaving the territory right around here, which accounted for why Ogbar was out here with both of these guys, obviously to introduce them as members of Devastation Inc. I think I read in an article somewhere too that Super Destroyer 2 was Bill Irwin, so he was the one wrestling in this match against Mike Reed. There's really not a whole lot to say about the actual match. You're introducing a new set of heels, so the whole thing was a showcase piece for the Super Ds. And they gave Mike Reed a little bit of shine, but not too much to where it overshadowed Bill Irwin. The finish was actually the best part, as Super D goes to hoist up Reed into the corner to give him a second rope superplex. And if you watch in the corner of the frame, you actually see David Manning's arm reach out while he's trying to assist Irwin in actually giving the suplex to Reed. And it was interesting hearing Bill Mercer refer to it as a suplex. Emphasis on suplex. Almost as good as Bill Watts referring to the suplex as the suplay. And there are actually still some old historians out there that get bent out of shape with the mispronunciation of suplay. Yeah. Tomato, tomato. What are you going to do? I mean, I still pronounce things in a weird way that people might cock their head sideways at. Root and route being the best example of that. I've always said root. Some people say route. Is what it is. Anyway, let's move on to the best part of the program. The street fight between Precious and Sunshine. Actually, who am I kidding? This is better than any street fight I've seen in wrestling in the last 30 years. Just to set the frame here, the match is a pre-tape of a Jimmy Garvin, Johnny Mantell TV match. Not sure what location they were filming this at, but it definitely wasn't the Sportatorium. Anyhow, the final minute of the match sees Garvin get dumped out to the floor, and when he gets back on the ring apron, Mantell goes to give him a suplex back into the ring, but Precious tries to trip up Mantell's foot so Garvin can fall on top of him for the pin, the old classic heel trope. However, it is a misfire from Precious because Mantell actually ends up rolling through and pinning Garvin after cradling him. Now, how that's actually possible, if this were real, I have no idea, but just roll with it. And here's where things get ultra spicy. It's an old urban legend, a saying that a wise individual once coined, that all women secretly hate one another. And when I was young, I always thought that was kind of blown out of proportion. Like, no, come on, man. Women are cult-like creatures. Like, they got friend groups inside friend groups inside friend groups. But then as I got older, and I actually started analyzing how women actually talk shit to one another behind their backs, I realized, yeah, you know what? That's kind of true. Women really do actually hate one another. It's usually over petty shit, but it's not entirely false. So, of course, here, Precious immediately points the finger at Sunshine, saying she's the one responsible for everything that went down in that finish. And, of course, we all saw, plain as day, it was Precious that got involved. So, at that point, you can pretty much tell where that whole thing was headed. And as soon as Sunshine and Precious started going after the hair, the people all leapt to their feet. Catfight! 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 But here's the twist. Because Garvin wasn't freely standing around watching that all go down. He actually restrained Sunshine and let Precious get in a few slaps before eventually siding with Precious. And when Sunshine went to spin Garvin around and slap him across the face, she ends up storming off while everyone rallies behind her. And that was Sunshine's official world-class babyface turn that we've kind of been alluding to and teasing on the podcast for a while. It's actually a very famous world-class angle that I've seen plenty of clips of over the years. One of my favorite angles they actually shot around that period, mostly just to hear the crowd respond to the girls fighting. But we weren't done there, because we had another memorable moment here on Dallas TV. After the official breakup of Sunshine and Garvin, Sunshine was here to host a press conference on the matter. This was... well, it was many things, actually. Breathtaking for one, because, Sunshine was there. But trying to be professional for a minute here. We've seen the evolution of Sunshine on Dallas TV from the very beginning. When she first showed up, she was very timid. Didn't really draw a whole lot of attention to herself because she was out there being Jimmy Garvin's hype man. She stood at ringside, looked pretty, cheered her man on. That was pretty much it. And then over the course of time, we saw her actively getting more involved in finishes, being more heelish on camera, engaging with the fans, blah, blah. And from a character standpoint, she actually grew to be just as important a piece of the pairing as Garvin was. And, she got so much more comfortable on camera, too. And this was really the first time we saw Sunshine actually get to do a real promo on Dallas TV. And boy, did she nail this thing. It was so good. Standing there talking about how her and Garvin are through. And that when she left him, she didn't just leave empty-handed. She took everything with her, including every single bit of footage that Garvin had her film during his matches. And you know who she gave everything to? The one man that Garvin's been ducking and dodging for the better part of a month now, Chris Adams. And now Adams has possession of those tapes, and he can use them to study and learn Garvin's ring style. So that when they actually have their American Heavyweight title match, Adams is going to know every move of Garvin's, inside and out. And Sunshine's going to be ringside to watch it all go down. As for that tramp that Garvin's now sided with, we can all bet that if she ever gets in Sunshine's face again, there will be a war. Her quote, not mine. She wants Garvin to remember that he wouldn't be anything without Sunshine, including the American Heavyweight Champion. She did a lot of things for Garvin that she never would have dreamed of doing before, all because she loved him and cared about him. And he threw it all away for that no-good tramp. And of course, Sunshine is so devastated with all this, she can't even finish her thought. So she takes off crying. And, well, it was pretty damn great. So I'm obviously spoiled because I've watched clips of this over the years, multiple times. So this kind of stands out as being one of the more memorable world-class memories of mine. But it still holds up going back and watching it again in 2022. All of it was well done. Everything worked well. Everybody played their roles to perfection. I hate saying played roles. Worked their roles to perfection. And even Garvin's little follow-up at his house was phenomenal. In his underwear, by the way, which is just classic. And he's overwhelmed with everything that's gone down. But when it comes to the breakup with Sunshine, he's not providing any further commentary. So, stay posted for the upcoming installment of World Class, the Lifetime Movie Experience. But, this is still 10 times better because the acting isn't hideously wretched. Then we had the Iceman King Parsons taking on Tonga John in a brief little match. I'll admit, the name Tonga John got a pop out of me. Of all names you affiliate with the Samoan legacy over the years in wrestling, John. Not one that immediately comes to mind. Not really much to say about the match, just a quick enhancement for Iceman. I did like the spot where Tonga John applied a standing bear hug to the Iceman by clasping his hands around Parsons' ass. Probably the only thing I got out of the actual segment. But the Iceman ended up going over with the butt. Perhaps that's why Tonga John had his hands clasped around Parsons' butt. He was trying to work the butt. Write that one down. Then we had another cool little segment involving the Von Erichs and Michael Hayes. Not a match, but an angle. And this one actually involved Fritz in the debuting Mike Von Erich, in addition to Kerry. This is a little two-parter, but we start with Fritz and Bill Mercer. And, Fritz is kind of laying out the field with everything that went down recently in Fort Worth, saying that Michael Hayes challenged Kerry to a loser leaves Dallas match, wherein the loser is prevented from wrestling in the Dallas region for 1 full year. And before he comments on that, we get the full footage with Kerry in the ring with Mike Von Erich, trying to present him with his own special entrance robe, since he will be debuting very soon. Wanted to give Mike a personal belonging of his to issue him the best of luck. And after Kerry took off and left the ring to Mike, this was Mike's first opportunity to sell himself on the mic. And, yeah. They all can't be winners. That is for sure. Mike Von Erich, not particularly good on the mic. He was definitely not what you would call a stellar promo, if you know what I mean. I would say he was slightly worse than Kevin Von Erich's promo work, and among the three main brothers, Kevin was definitely the weakest of the brothers. So, yeah, it is what it is. Poor Mike didn't have the promo genes like David and Kerry did, unfortunately. Now, there's a caveat here because he was also distracted by Michael Hayes, who came out to the ring to try and intimidate Mike. So he goes in the ring, rips up Kerry's jacket, and basically tries to scare old Mikey out of the ring. And, of course, Mike wasn't having any of Hayes' bullshit, so he tries to tackle Hayes to the ground and pound away on him. And I use those in loose air quotes because, obviously, for those of you that have not seen this, you probably don't know what I'm talking about, but let's just say Mike was not exactly laying in his shots. It came across very worked. And I'm not sure if that was the jitterbugs or Mike just being very green or uncomfortable, but yeah, it didn't make for a particularly good camera moment. But Hayes ended up turning the tables and tossing Mike out to the floor, and Mike did take one of the best bumps I have ever seen out to the concrete. He actually literally took a flip bump through the middle rope, landed flat on his tailbone. I have no idea how much of that was a work or a shoot, but if Hayes legitimately put all his effort into throwing Mike Von Erich out to the floor, I would not be surprised. Goddamn, that spill looked disgusting. But of course, Kerry ends up coming back out to fight off Hayes, and that scuffle pretty much went on until Buddy Roberts tried to run down and make the save. And of course, Freebirds get run off like they normally do. I think someone also jacked Buddy's wig, which also made for a spectacular TV moment. But another pretty big angle here. And again, all to set up Michael Hayes and Kerry Von Erich at the upcoming Star Wars special. And the loser of that match must leave the Dallas territory for 1 full year. But the other little detail here is that there has to be a winner in that fall. So to ensure that it is a fair fight and that the Freebirds can't pull a fast one over the Von Erichs, Fritz is going to be in the building to, I guess, act as an enforcer for the match of some sort. He also said that he was there to watch his son debut, but he will be ringside. So some pretty high stakes there. And we'll obviously be covering that on delay, but stay posted for that review, because they're basically saying the quiet part out loud that Fritz is probably going to play a role in that finish. And for the record, if you know what Fritz looks and sounds like, I need say no more. And that actually was a perfect segue into the main event for the show this week. A country whipping match between the Von Erichs and the Freebirds, where, I'm not exaggerating, Kerry and Kevin whipped the shit out of Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy with leather straps for approximately 10 minutes. That was the entirety of the match, and the crowd went ballistic for every minute of it. And of course, the ironic thing is that there are actual rules to this match, so that there can be some kind of order. Not that the rules actually applied, because nobody was going to follow them. nor did the people watching give a fuck. They just wanted to see the Freebirds get whipped like government mules. Ain't too many heels in today's business where you could actually do a match like this and make it work. Once upon a time, I may have thrown MJF into that conversation when he was an actual despicable heel that everybody loathed. Unfortunately now, he's really the only redeeming quality about AEW, so of course people are going to cheer him like crazy. Anyway, the Freebirds got a little bit of heat by working over Kevin, cheating of course, and the leather straps were obviously going to come into play there. And that obviously led to the finish where all four guys were in the ring just beating each other to death before David Manning finally threw the match out and just went, fuck this, we're done. And in the aftermath where the Von Erichs are basically holding Michael Hayes down and whipping his ass from pillar to post, it is deafening in the building with how loud everyone is cheering for it. I mean, I guess I can look at it as a smart fan and think, well, you booked a strap match between the two teams who have been at each other's throats for the better part of a year. The fuck did you think was going to happen when you booked them in a strap match where they were actually going to adhere to rules of any kind? Of course, they weren't going to follow any of that. Still a fun segment. And again, everyone was on their feet as soon as the Von Erichs started going to town on Hayes and Gordy. Those fans did not give two shits about tag team competition in this environment. They just wanted to see some bruising and welting. And boy, did they get a payoff for that. I mean, it was an extended angle. Much like a lot of the show was this week. Lots of angle advancement. Not really a whole lot to report on in terms of matches. But we got a major storyline push in the Jimmy Garvin Sunshine Precious department. The breakup is official. Sunshine is now officially babyface. And now we await to see her role in the upcoming Chris Adams Jimmy Garvin blow-off. We also had the setup to the Carrie Hayes Loser Leaves Town match. So that'll be a big selling point for the Star Wars event. Man, we're already approaching the year anniversary when everything went down. The Freebirds heel turn in the cage. And it's all coming full circle at the end of 83 where Hayes and Carrie are finally going to settle the score once and for all and find out who's going to get ousted from the Dallas territory. For good. For 365 days. Looking forward to talking more about it in the future, but for now, we'll wrap things up for the FSWR podcast. This weekend, it'll be a normal weekend, because the Full Gear show is not until next weekend. Plan on me doing a little bit of a preview card rundown for the Full Gear show on the Dynamite Report next week. I'm probably not going to I'm not going to spend too long talking about it, because quite frankly, I still don't even really know what half that card is going to shape up to be anyway. I know what the main event is, but it's pretty much it off the top of my head. But we'll kind of run down that card and focus more on the AEW side of things going into the weekend. For the upcoming Monday show, though, kind of the status quo. We'll be doing the Retro Raw report, SmackDown report, and kind of lead things off with there. Until then, thanks for watching, everyone. Take care, all. Peace out.